Friends, how far we've come on this bizarre adventure. Oh, you didn't really think we were going to end the year without covering this one, did you? But the time is finally here for us to discuss the most prolific part in all of JoJo's, the legendary Part 3, starring the iconic Jotaro Kujo. But given the vast success of Part 2, what was it that caused Araki to so drastically change the formula of his series? And what is it about this change that would so heavily influence not only the rest of JoJo's, but shonen storytelling in general? And finally, what is it that makes Jotaro Kujo one of the most widely recognized and wildly popular characters in the series' legendary history? Well friends, one more time, that is exactly what we're here to discuss. So let's get on a plane to Egypt, remember that this is most definitely the work of an enemy stand, and let's talk about why you should watch JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. The biggest change to Part 3 is something that I have been dying to talk about since our first video, and that is the addition of stands to the JoJo's universe. Stands are ghost-like beings that are created from the spiritual energy of their user. Stands would have massive ramifications not only on JoJo's, but pretty much any shonen series that was created in the decades that followed. Hunter x Hunter, Naruto, One Piece all have been influenced by the existence of stands. I think the best way to think of stands, if you're unfamiliar, is that they're kind of like an extra limb. They, with few exceptions, don't have their own personality and are understood to be a physical manifestation of the stand user's life force. And I think to really get into why stands are such a big deal in JoJo's, we need to follow them right back to their origins in Chinese religion and mysticism, namely the concept of ki, also known as ki or chi. Ki is the idea that we all have an inner life force flowing within us, and certain people will claim that with enough physical, mental, or spiritual training, ki can be harnessed in a multitude of different ways, such as healing, starting fires with your bare hands, or even knocking someone out without laying a single finger on them. The actual validity of ki is up for debate, and not something we're going to get into here, but the reason this is important for storytelling, in particular shonen storytelling, is that ki was used in the early days of contemporary shonen manga as a narrative excuse that let regular biological humans perform the same kind of superhuman feats that had previously been confined to robotic sci-fi characters like Astro Boy and Kamen Rider, thus giving plain old humans the mystical grounding to be able to do things like fly and use laser attacks. It might seem like a simple concept now, but it dramatically changed the landscape of shonen manga, with 70s sci-fi manga like Mazinger Z, Cyborg 009, and Space Battleship Yamato being replaced by more mystical martial arts-based series of the 80s like Fist of the North Star, Dragon Ball, and of course, JoJo's. While other series dabbled with the idea of ki, Dragon Ball would be the first major title to push the concept into its contemporary form, and it did this by combining popular elements of sports manga, such as training and growing ever stronger, with martial arts based ki, which essentially put no limit on how powerful the characters could get over time. And while this was initially a very good thing, it did come with some long-term problems, like supporting cast being pushed further into the background, or just flat out running out of ways to express new levels of power. For example, as Dragon Ball went on and continued into Dragon Ball Z, Goku's power could be measured by the size of his Kamehameha energy blast, with it eventually reaching near galactic proportions, at which point you're not really left with very many meaningful ways to represent a character's progression of power. And once a character has become this powerful, it severely limits what can be seen as a viable threat to them, which also greatly limits the kind of battles that can occur. And this is a barrier that Araki was coming up against at the end of Part 2. Jonathan had defeated a vampire, Joseph had beaten a god. Where could the series go from there, while still keeping the combat encounters relative and interesting? And the answer Araki came to was stands. See, it's not really about how strong a stand is as much as it is what specifically a stand can do. Each stand has its own unique abilities that come with their own strengths and weaknesses, from the very basic like Jotaro's close range Star Platinum, who can basically just punch very fast and very very hard, to the more complex ones like centerfolds, who can attack you from inside the reflection of a mirror, or Mariah, who holds power over magnetism. This essentially means that there is no perfect stand. Sure, there are insanely overpowered ones, but for the most part, no matter what kind of stand you have, there is someone out there with a perfect counter to your ability. Which is why Jotaro can go toe to toe with Vampire Lord Dio in part 3, and get his ass kicked by a rat in part 4. This means that Araki never has to worry about the problems that come with long-term power level escalation. A fact proven now that it's nearly 30 years later, and we're still getting stand battles that feel fresh and original. The other genius thing about stands is that they don't require any physical, mental, or spiritual training. While there are various different ways to obtain one, you can't really work or study for it. And this means that a stand's strength is entirely separate from that of the stand user, meaning that literally anyone can have a stand. Like seriously, dogs, babies, monkeys, Polnareff, anything. Physical appearance give no indication of who a stand user might be, nor how dangerous they might become. And this serves two distinct purposes in the story. For one, it keeps everyone in Jojo's world vulnerable. No matter how strong your stand is, you yourself are still just a plain old human, meaning that you're only ever one wrong move away from getting the literal soul aura'd from your body. And this keeps every fight in Jojo's tense, exciting, and strategic, as no victory is ever assured. Second, it sells the fantasy that no matter who you are, you could be a stand user just the way you are right now. It would take years of training to be able to compete in the Budokai tournaments from Dragon Ball, but according to Jojo's world, there's nothing stopping even the most average person from obtaining a stand. If stands were real, which I wish they were. I think this is also why the cast of the Persona games are so much more relatable than your average JRPG cast. They're just a bunch of regular kids, but their personas give them the fantasy grounding to be able to fight back against the shadows. The final and possibly biggest advantage of stands is the level of creativity and diversity it brings to the combat encounters, as no two fights ever even feel remotely similar. And it adds this tense puzzle dynamic to the fights. If your stand can do this, then what does mine have to do to be able to counter that? And it leads to some really crazy situations. Like, how do you fight someone with no direct offensive abilities, except that his stand can turn you into a child, oh, and he has an axe. We're going to dive a little deeper into the fights later on, but for now, I think it's time we talk about the world and characters of Stardust Crusaders. Part 3 opens up and two things are immediately obvious. For one, the visuals look like they got a massive bump since Part 2, and second, everyone's favourite walking nightmare, Dio Brando, is back and he is crazier than ever. Right off the bat, what I love about Dio being the villain for this arc is how it recontextualizes Part 1. All of a sudden you realise that Phantom Blood wasn't really Jonathan's story, it was Dio's, and also makes Jonathan a far more tragic character as you realise he didn't really beat Dio, he just prolonged the vampire's eventual victory. As if Dio himself wasn't enough of a threat, he's been lying at the bottom of the ocean for the better part of a century. And aside from just being fucking Dio, he's now crazy with a full-blown god complex and terrifying new abilities of his stand, the world. And it's up to our main protagonist and great-great-grandson of Jonathan Joestar alongside his ragtag posse to travel to Cairo and put an end to the maniacal vampire once and for all. And that protagonist is, of course, the iconic Jotaro Kujo. The phrase badass is overused to the point of redundancy, but Jotaro Kujo is like every badass moment from every film, comic, and TV show squeezed into a single person. Even Clint Eastwood thinks Jotaro is cool, and if Clint Eastwood thinks you're cool, then you probably are. It's interesting to look at the evolution of protagonists from parts 1 to 3, as you'll notice there's a huge shift in the way Araki writes his characters. We talked a lot about internal mechanics in our part 2 video, how Jonathan was very much an externally written character with very little emphasis placed on his inner thoughts or dialogue, and Joseph was kind of a mix. On the surface he was a goofy trickster, but internally he was a strategic genius. So if we were to chart them, Jonathan being external, Joseph being both external and internal, Jotaro is nearly entirely internal, meaning that he gives practically nothing away of his own thoughts or emotions. However, despite how little the character shows on the surface, there's always the sense that he has his own internal logic, his own way of dealing with problems, and very particular ideas about what's right and wrong. He's quite reminiscent of the steely American crime action stars of the late 70s and early 80s, characters like Detective Kojak and Dirty Harry, who incidentally Jotaro's iconic pose was based on. Jotaro really works as a character on two specific levels. For one, as mentioned above, he's really cool, but this is actively worked into his character and battle style. Unlike Joseph, he keeps his movements to an absolute minimum. Any play he does make is considered, focused and decisive, and it's not unusual for him to sit back over the course of an entire battle, only to, in the last minute, reveal some small detail that his enemy has overlooked and leads to their undoing. Much like a hard-boiled crime detective figuring out some vital final clue and solving a case in the final second. The second level is that it leaves Jotaro's actual character as somewhat of a mystery to the viewer. It's often difficult to tell how he feels about any given situation, or even those around him. In fact, at first he seems downright cold. He's disrespectful to his mom and reluctant to have anything to do with Joseph and the rest of the guys. But then occasionally you get these little glimpses into who he really is. Take episode 2 for example. Up until this point, we've barely seen him show anything but disdain towards his mother Holly, but then he comments that she looks a little pale and checks to see if she's feeling alright. It's a small detail, but it contrasts so much with the way he's been acting up until now that it really strikes a note, and leads us to believe that there might be more to his character than your plain old hooligan badass. This is the kind of writing that makes his character so endearing. He gives very little away, but when he does, it's a big deal. And observing him closely and figuring out this side of him is one of the main pleasures of Stardust Crusaders. Jotaro's character arc would continue well beyond part 3 and even as late as part 6, at which point we're still learning things about him that are both surprising and touching. And I think this is a big part of why a character conceived nearly 3 decades ago remains so popular to this day. Jotaro is joined on his journey to Cairo by his posse, the Stardust Crusaders, comprised of his great-grandfather and previous protagonist of Part 2, the irreverent and infinitely likeable Joseph Joestar, the polite and diligent Kakyoin, the stoic and reliable Avdol, clown of the group Polnareff, and Iggy, who surely wins the award for Best Anime Dog. While I think some members of the group are a little underdeveloped, especially Avdol, who I really had a lot of trouble writing about in that previous sentence, their strength lies in the endearing camaraderie that forms between them as the journey continues. It's never the main focus, but we do get a lot of fun little tidbits about the characters, like Kakyoin and Polnareff's secret handshake, or the fact that Joseph knows Kakyoin is indeed Kakyoin, and not an evil doppelganger, purely by virtue that he refuses to take off his school uniform while sunbathing. Joseph's presence among the cast also really drives home the generational aspect of JoJo's. While parts 1 and 2 basically existed in isolation, part 3 feels much more like a culmination of everything that's led up to this point, having direct ties to the 2 previous parts. And this adds a lot of weight to the proceedings. When Jotaro and Dio finally step out to face each other, there's a real feeling that this is a showdown multiple generations in the making. I think one aspect of JoJo's that really separates it from a lot of other anime and manga is Araki's fondness for exploring foreign land through his stories. It was a huge part of parts 1 and 2, but it is the main focus of part 3, starting in Japan and ending in Cairo, Egypt. And I think where part 3 really shines is how it communicates the idea of the journey. You saw glimmers of this in Phantom Blood and Battle Tendency, but for the most part, any globe hopping that happened in those were basically just a beginning point and an end point, whereas part 3 is much more focused on the actual act of travel itself. And this is another huge aspect of its appeal. Throughout Stardust Crusaders, you can feel what seems like Araki's very genuine fascination with foreign culture. He seems to delight in exploring all the strange little eccentricities of each new land, and this gives each individual sub-arc a really distinct setting, look, and atmosphere. This really sells the idea that this is a real journey you're on, but what's more, when you've been watching it for a while, you genuinely feel like you're taking a road trip with you and a bunch of your dumb buddies. Another advantage to this road trip style narrative, it's how it's used to set up for the many unique and exciting stand battles of part 3. And I think this can be best summarised with a quote from Araki from volume 3 of Stardust Crusaders. "When I'm travelling, I can feel very lonely, so I appreciate the kindness of strangers from the bottom of my heart. Still, sometimes I start wondering why someone is being nice to me. Are they actually evil and planning my demise? who's my friend, who's my enemy. The idea of danger coming from an unfamiliar place is a pretty core fundamental fear that mostly anyone will be able to relate to. But it's the way Araki works this fear into his battles that's really clever. I would say your average fight in media can be broken down into 3 parts. Engagement, where the two combatants face each other for the first time. Struggle, where the actual fight takes place and the characters wrestle for dominance. And resolution, where the winner wins and the loser loses. And from part 3 onwards, Araki would add a 4th stage. The mystery. The mystery takes place usually before our characters even know they're in a fight, but it's the section of the encounter where something around our heroes seems amiss, or the opponent has not yet properly revealed themselves or their abilities. This means that before the fight can even begin, our boys must figure out if they are being attacked, who's doing it, and how. And it's this that relates back to the feeling of unease Araki wrote about. This adds an extra layer of fear and tension to the battles of part 3, as it's never a simple case of just beating up the person in front of you, but instead figuring out who that person is and what exactly their stand can do. You can certainly see other series that have this style of encounter. There's a lot in the Yu Yu Hakusho chapter Black arc, for example, but no series really commits to it in the same ways that Jojo's does. Take the Tower of Grey fight, where when aboard an aeroplane, our heroes are attacked by a stand user wielding a vicious stag beetle type stand. The enemy is most certainly another passenger on the plane, and this initial mystery adds a terrific layer of tension to the encounter, as our heroes scramble to figure out who among the crowded aisles is targeting them. The stands also give the fights a huge amount of depth and variety, as it basically takes off all limitations of what a fight can even be. There's even several encounters where not a single punch is thrown, and they're some of the most exciting in the entire series, like Jotaro's deadly game of poker with Darby the Gambler, or Kakuin's life or death video game battle with Darby Jr. Other standout encounters include the nightmarish dream battle with Death 13, which takes place entirely within our hero's dreams, Freddy Krueger style. And my personal favourite, the brutal struggle between best dog ever Iggy and the unbelievably frightening and intimidating Falcon Pet Shop, both of whom are stand users. It's a testament to both Araki and the animators of this episode that they can make a battle between two animals barely bigger than rodents and make it one of the most nail-bitingly intense and shocking of the entire series. The production of part 3 is also a significant improvement over parts 1 and 2. It seems like a lot of work was put into capturing the distinct look and feel of the manga, which is no small feat given how, at this point in his career, Araki had improved to such a degree that his drawings had reached a new level entirely, feeling all at once densely detailed but also expressive and energetic. While the animation isn't overly elaborate, the character artwork is strong, with a lot of intensely detailed still shots, and I think better represents the style of part 3 than excessive animation might have. And it's all backed up by some really terrific direction. Direction is always important in media, but it's especially important for a show like Jojo's, where a lot of the major plot points involve characters simply realizing things, like the nature of a stand or the identity of its user. And the way the colors, tone, and music all shift and work in conjunction to sell these moments is one of the strongest aspects of its entire production. Also, a huge shout out to Daisuke Ono, the voice of Jotaro, who perfectly captures the character's gruff, stoic exterior while infusing him with enough charm and charisma that he never comes across as too much of a dick, which I imagine was a tough line to tread. It's also worth noting that while JoJo OPs up until this point have been incredibly strong, Stand Proud might just be my favourite OP of all time. Studio Kamikaze Doga have really outdone themselves, combining an intensely pounding rock track with some of the most dynamic, exciting, and detailed visuals in the business. If you have not already, go check out Mother's Basement's fantastic breakdown of the OP. The work and nuance that's gone into it is simply incredible. Unfortunately, there are a few downsides to part 3. While the stand system offers many advantages over the standard battle system of the time, you can see parts where Araki himself is still very much figuring out the details. Star Platinum's powers are a little inconsistent to say the least, and there's a few times when he develops a miraculous new ability in the final moments of a battle that saves the day, and honestly it just feels a little cheap sometimes. Stands tend to be at their most interesting when their abilities are limited and specific, but it's the creativity of the stand user that makes them dangerous. Some good examples being the Lock from part 4, Bruno's Portals from part 5, or Jolene's Web from part 6. But some of the stands from part 3 feel a little basic. Like, take Avdol's Magician's Red. It can shoot fire, that's kind of its thing. Or this guy who can swim pretty good, I guess, which results in the odd stand battle that doesn't really hit home. But given that Araki was still pretty much figuring out the system as he was writing part 3, you can overlook it. The final thing I want to talk about for part 3 gets a little spoilery, so skip to the time shown on screen if you want to avoid. As anyone who's seen Stardust Crusaders will tell you, the last part of the series gets pretty dark. The battles get more violent and intense, and the show takes on a far more somber tone, with a far darker and more macabre visual style and colour palette. And tragically, characters who have been with us for nearly the entire series suffer some pretty gruesome and harrowing deaths. It's surprising in a lot of ways, even feeling a little disjointed. In one episode, Jojo is playing baseball on a Super Nintendo, and in the next, we're introduced to the horrifying Vanilla Ice and his stand Cream, who is a degree of magnitude more dangerous than anything that's come up to this point, and it leads to one of the most desperate and tragic stand battles of the entire show. This continues right up until the concluding moments of Jotaro's monumental battle with Dio, and as the sun sets on the final scene, it's hard not to feel like the series ends on a somewhat melancholy tone. I was initially puzzled about why Araki chose to end this series in this manner, and after giving it some thought, here's my conclusion. When I was a teenager, me and a few friends ended up cycling across France, and while I remember being so excited to reach our goal, when I think back to it now, what stands out for me the most is not the journey's conclusion, but all the weird and fun things that happened along the way. And that's the exact feeling I get when I watch Stardust Crusaders. Even though things go very wrong for our heroes in the final act, it's the journey that brought them there and the adventures they shared along the way that really matters. And I think this is Araki's message with part 3. The destination will always be far less important than the journey that gets you there. And oddly enough, I think it's this same philosophy that makes Araki such a great author. He doesn't see his stories as a beginning point and an end point, but as a journey, and one that he takes delight in every single step of. And while reading Jojo's, it's apparent that no one is more excited to see what happens than Araki himself. And I think it's this earnest enthusiasm that pushes him to move on from what's come before and to raise his series to new heights. The journey of Stardust Crusaders is a great goddamn story, but even more than that, it represents one of the high points for an author who, even despite his previous accomplishments, is willing to entirely reinvent his series and set out on a brand new bizarre adventure all over again. And this, friends, more than any other reason, is why you should watch Jojo's Bizarre Adventure Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. Friends, this draws to a close this video and also this year. A small announcement, I am going to be at MagFest 2017. I look like this and I'll be wearing this t-shirt. Follow me on Twitter for more info, but if you do see me, feel free to say hi. Once again, I just sincerely want to thank you for joining me on what has honestly been a very bizarre adventure on my part. Watching this channel grow and gain momentum has honestly been incredible, and I have some big plans for 2017. Once again, you can of course find me on Twitter at @ipatchwolf, but maybe you want to check out the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast for our climactic 2016 Game of the Year Showdown, where we'll be taking a look back at 2016 and pitting its best games against each other for the coveted Let's Fight a Boss Game of the Year award. I'm going to take a much needed rest for the next week or two, but I will be back in January. But until then, friends, enjoy doing whatever the hell it is you enjoy doing this holiday season. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next year.